Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. You know how every now and then you encounter an author who was immensely popular in his or her time, but their star seems to have faded? John Galsworthy is one of those authors. I mean, everybody and his mother read the Forsyte Saga back when it was published, but today it would be difficult to find somebody with whom to have a good conversation on this great piece of work, these great novels. If you read them, you know exactly what I mean, and you probably had to do the next best thing, which is to go on YouTube and look for a video on these books. Why is that? Well, that's one of the many issues, one of the many questions that we are going to explore today as we approach the work of John Galsworthy, in particular the Forsyte Saga. We are doing the Nobel Prize in Literature series or podcast, so the first thing I want to do, as we tend to do, is to share with you the Nobel Prize citation. So John Galsworthy was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 1932 for his distinguished art of narration, which takes its highest form in the Forsyte Saga. As you know, the Nobel Prize in Literature, you receive it not for one work that you wrote, but for your entire body of work, so the entire corpus of a given author. However, there are times in which the Swedish Academy has actually mentioned, pinpointed to one particular work in the Nobel Prize citation. For example, we looked at Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann. That is a good example of that. There are many others. I can think of Theodor Mommsen, his History of Rome. It was very clearly, pinpointed when it comes to the award and the citation. Then there's also the case of Knut Hamsun with Growth of the Soil, and there are maybe 5 or 6 more like that. The Forsyte Saga, the book that we know under that title, is a trilogy. But as a matter of fact, if you look at all of Galsworthy's novels about the family of the Forsytes or people who are associated with them, you have in fact 3 trilogies and 1 collection of short stories. We're going to touch upon this very briefly in a few moments when we look at the story beyond the books that we're going to be exploring in this video. So the first thing, after sharing with you the Nobel Prize citation and all that kind of stuff, I want to look at the main theme, okay? One of my favorite authors, Erich Fromm, said that in a society that is devoted to consumption and ownership, that has that as its main focus, it is not at all surprising that people would end up seeing each other, perceiving each other, and even treating each other as objects of ownership and property. So according to one of the characters in the novels of the Forsyte Saga, there are 2 qualities that are the real test of a Forsyte, and I want to share those with you. The first one is, quote, the power of never being able to give yourself up to anything, body and soul. And the second one is the sense of property. Now, as far as it is reasonable to say that a given book is about a single topic, especially when you're talking about an 878 page work, which are 3 novels, of course. As far as we can say that, I would say that the Forsyte Saga is in fact about exactly the sense of property. Now, what kind of work is this? Okay, so I place the Forsyte Saga under the same category as I would War and Peace, Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann, Jean Christophe by Romain Rolland, Thibault by Roger Martin Dugard, and many works of that sort. What I mean here is novels or series of novels that trace the development of one or more characters very extensively. Some of these have been called river novels because it's kind of like a river that flows and you keep, tracing where it goes with the characters and their fates and all that kind of stuff. Now, there are, of course, many differences when it comes to the approach of these very different books that I have just mentioned to you, and I'm going to give you a quick example. John Galsworthy in the Forsyte Saga, he doesn't fictionalize historical events maybe as Tolstoy does in War and Peace. So that's what I mean when I say that this is a kind of a different narrative approach. But what we have here is the story of a family. Now you have to add something to that. That by itself is not enough. This is an archetypal family. In the preface, John Galsworthy says that there are many Forsytes in the world. So, once again, an archetype. I was thinking of the character Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Babbitt came to mean a certain type of person. The word was used based on the novel. it had that kind of a legacy. So it's the same with the Forsytes, and maybe that's one of the reasons why this was so popular when it was published, because people actually read about this family and they felt that they knew them, they knew people like them. So it's true to life. We're going to explore the contents now of the first trilogy. So just to kind of confirm, when I say the Forsyte Saga in this video, what I mean is the book that we know as the Forsyte Saga, which is the first trilogy. The whole thing has been called the Forsyte Chronicles. So the Forsyte Saga is the one that we're going to be focusing on. And here what you have is 3 novels and 2 interludes. Now, this as a book, right, as one book, as a single volume, it was published for the first time in 1922. But I want to give you the dates and kind of the scope, the time period that is covered for the individual novels. So the first one is titled The Man of Property. It was published in the year 1906, and it basically takes place in the 1880s. Then we come to the second novel, In Chancery, published in 1920, and with this one we are kind of at the turn of the century. And finally you have To Let, which was published in the year 1921, and this covers the years between the 2 wars. Now the interludes that I mentioned before. You have one interlude happening between the first 2 novels titled Indian Summer of a Forsyte. It focuses on one of the old Forsytes. And then the other interlude, which happens between the 2 other novels, the second and the third, is titled Awakening, and it deals with a little boy. So you can see an interesting contrast there between the interludes. One of them dealing with the older generation and the other dealing with the younger people. I want to give you a quick synopsis. I don't want to spoil the reading experience for you. That is an approach that I tend to follow in most of my videos. So I should probably call this an overview. Okay, so synopsis, overview, what you will. There are 4 generations of Forsytes that we hear about in this first trilogy. But for the most part, the entire trilogy focuses on one event and its consequences. And that event is the marriage between Soames Forsyte and Irene Heron. Galsworthy himself says in the preface to this part of the saga, or the chronicle, that in a way the Forsyte Saga is about a family's response to Irene. Okay, and Irene is the incarnation of the concept of beauty, if you will, and we see her through the eyes of the other characters. So that is why this is central. In a way, even though this is a very lengthy text, it's not that difficult to summarize it, you're going to realize. In the first novel, which by the way bears the influence of Anna Karenina very, very clearly, what happens is that at the beginning you have the engagement of June Forsyte to Philip Bosony, who is an architect. And then there's Soames Forsyte, who, as I told you, marries Irene Heron. She is the daughter of a poor widowed professor. So here's the thing. Soames feels that he cannot fully possess Irene. There seems to be an abyss between them. So what does he do? He hires Philip Bosony, the architect, to build a mansion for him. Or for her, if you want, because what he wants is this mansion that is going to make Irene fall in love really and fully with Soames. Here's the problem. Something develops between Irene and Philip Bosony, the architect. So bad news that we have right here. Soames is not happy about that, and so he decides in his own way to take revenge, and he does something incredibly despicable. Okay, I'm gonna let you find out for yourself. That is the first novel, and I can't really tell you that much without spoiling the whole experience for you about the other novels, about the other 2. So we're going to just lightly touch upon them. As a matter of fact, I wanted to let you know that in this edition that I have, which is the Scribner edition, you have, as a matter of fact, I don't know if you can see it, but you have a family tree at the beginning of the text. And just looking at that family tree, which is very helpful in many ways, is going to spoil many of the surprises, many of the plot points for you, because you find out, who married who and who passed away and all that kind of stuff. So I would say use it sparingly, right? So that is the first novel. Let me just say that the second novel shows you some kind of resolution to the entanglements that we encountered in the first one, and then the third novel explores the following generation of Forsytes. For the most part, the characters of Fleur and John. And it also tells you about their entanglements and just, these young folks learning about their parents and trying to escape the past, which, as you know, is a very difficult thing because, of course, the past is never dead. It's not even past, etc., etc. Style. Okay, let's talk about style. I would say that today the style of John Galsworthy may seem a little bit too adorned for most readers or for the general reader. But to put that into perspective, I think you need only read something by Henry James, good comparison here, especially the later works by Henry James, in order to have that sense of perspective. You know what they say about Henry James. Sometimes it's really difficult to tell what is going on, if anything is going on at all. Now, Galsworthy is a lot more straightforward than that. Okay, so for that reason, I would describe John Galsworthy in terms of style as a more direct Henry James, and maybe a more serious Evelyn Waugh. Though there are some very, very subtle moments of humor in the Forsyte Saga. Very subtle, okay, very British. But on the other hand, you also have works by Evelyn Waugh which are not the hilarious type of work that he is mostly known for. So this is kind of like looking at shades right here. But I think that is helpful in terms of approaching the style of John Galsworthy. The saga continues. Okay, I told you I would let you know a little bit about the following works that have to do with this family. So after the book that we know as the Forsyte Saga, John Galsworthy continued to explore this family and also some branches of it in 2 more trilogies and a collection of short stories. So after this trilogy, if you want to continue reading the story, what you have to read is the collection of short stories, which is titled On Forsyte Change. And that one was published in the year 1930. So yes, it was published after the second trilogy, but you're supposed to read it after the first trilogy. I read this collection of stories and I enjoyed it very much. It deals primarily with the old generation of Forsytes. So the ones that you hear about at first in the Forsyte Saga, meaning the first trilogy. The second trilogy is titled A Modern Comedy. It was published in 1929, and for the most part it focuses on Solmes and Fleur. So you have those 2 generations right there. And then after that you have End of the Chapter, the third trilogy, published in the year 1934. And this one deals not directly with a character who is a Forsyte, but somebody who's a cousin and this character's family. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say that sometimes it goes to one of the branches, and that's what happens in the third trilogy. So question here, maybe expected because I told you we would touch upon this. Why is John Galsworthy so neglected nowadays? Why is it so difficult to find somebody to have a good conversation with on these books? Well, here are my 2 cents on it. You can take this for what it's worth. I think John Galsworthy represents a tradition that belongs to the past. If you will, we could look at him as the last of the realists, or the last of the great British realists, right? He belongs to the tradition of Jane Austen, for sure, maybe in a similar vein to Henry James, as we were saying before. And the next generation, here's part of the issue, the modernists, had nothing but contempt for John Galsworthy. Especially Virginia Woolf. Okay, she's one of my favorite authors. I need to tell you about her. I promised this, and I know I haven't forgotten, so please be on the lookout for that. But Virginia Woolf was particularly acerbic when it came to John Galsworthy, to the point that she felt thankful when John Galsworthy died. Okay, so this is like, some strong feelings going on right there. As I was reading that, I thought of a similar example in the realm of Spanish letters, okay, in Spanish literature. You may have read Benito Pérez Galdós. Okay, Benito Pérez Galdós, in his time, when he was like at the peak, at the height of his career, he was revered. He was like, venerated by people. He was a great realist, wonderful novelist, the model of what a novelist should be at that time. Well, when the following generation came, they completely destroyed him, his reputation and everything. They had nothing but contempt for him also. Now, going back to the issue, of his popularity, the Nobel Prize and all that, putting it a little bit into context, Henry James was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 3 times, including the year of his death. And I think, there's no way to tell, right? You know how these things go, but I believe that eventually he might have won the Nobel Prize in Literature. But the thing is, he was not awarded the prize. John Galsworthy, on the other hand, he was nominated 6 times before he won the award. So you see what I'm saying right here? There are some authors who represent a tradition, you know, and maybe that is the reason sometimes why they receive a certain award. They receive the award in the name of all the important figures that came before, but who, for whatever reason, did not get the chance to receive that award. I'm thinking, you know, the case of Ivan Bunin in Russian letters. I mean, question, right? Why would you read Ivan Bunin when you can read Anton Chekhov? You know what I'm saying here? I mean, I would still read Bunin because I read everything that I can. I'm a completist, and of course I'm doing the Nobel Prize thing, but you see what I'm saying right here, right? So I just wanted to throw in that as a kind of an explanation, maybe, or food for thought, you know, not necessarily like a solid theory, but just something that we can talk about. I believe that primarily the issue here is that people will probably prefer to read Henry James, or they would, of course, prefer to read Jane Austen, you know, other than John Galsworthy. But I'm going to say that the bottom line is this. The Forsyte Saga is a very long text. We're looking at 3 novels, you know, almost 900 pages in length. But I would say if you get the chance, you know, please give this work your time. I believe it deserves it. And I think you could at least read the first trilogy, and then you can decide, you know, if you want to go with the others or not. These novels are about a society that doesn't exist anymore, Edwardian England, and how they were looking back, their consciousness of the past, you know, Victorian England, which is another thing that doesn't exist anymore, and how they were seeing that that previous generation, that previous ideal, if you will, was kind of slowly ebbing away from them. So that's what you have right here. That's the kind of conflict that you're going to encounter in these novels. And Galsworthy's view of this, his purpose with these novels, was to, as he put it, you know, quote unquote, embalm the upper middle class. And this is a class that he belonged to. And I believe that he was successful. You know, I think that that is exactly what the Forsyte Saga does. I do want to read the other trilogies because I am really curious to know what happened to the characters, especially the second trilogy, because we follow, you know, Solmes and Fleur, and I want to know what happened to them and the characters around them. So I want to hear about their fates. Someday I'm going to read them if I can. You know, I will definitely let you know when that happens. If I do, and when I do, I'll let you know, but I don't really know when that's going to happen. But I definitely have the interest in these books. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes, prophecies, donations? No, I don't need any of those. Thank you so much. Just let me know as usual. Those were my 2 cents on the Forsyte Saga by John Galsworthy, a great trilogy that I encourage you to check out. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.